Good evening, my name's Rebecca Adil, the Director of HistFest, and I am delighted to welcome you to this evening's event, Shakespeare's Sisters. Before we get started, there are just a couple of housekeeping points to note. Using the menu above, you can provide feedback on the event, and also, if you wish, donate to the British Library. The library is a charity, and your support really does help open up a world of inspiration and knowledge to everyone. Your feedback's also incredibly important in helping the library plan future cultural events. Below the video, you'll find the option for subtitles. This will also bring up our British Sign Language interpreter, Gabby Allen. Also below are social media links, in case you want to continue the conversation on other platforms during or after the event. If you do this, please use the hashtag Shakespeare's Sisters. We have a wonderful and wide-ranging panel discussion lined up for you, with Shakespearean actor Adjoa Andoh, theatre historian Dr Andy Kesson, intellectual historian Dr Vanessa Lim, and chaired by early modern historian and author of Witchcraft in Early Modern Poland, Dr Wanda Wyporska. Before we get on to the main discussion, I'm thrilled to first present an exclusive reading from Shakespeare's Richard II by the peerless Adjoa Andoh. Enjoy.
I have been studying how I may compare this prison where I live unto the world. And because the world is populous, and here is not a creature but myself, I cannot do it. Yet I'll hammer it out. My brain I'll prove the female to my soul the father, and these two beget a generation of still breeding thoughts. And these some thoughts people this little world, in humours like the people of this world, for no thought is contented. The better sorts, as of things divine, are intermixed with scruples, and do set the word itself against the word, as thus, "Come, little ones," and then again, "It is as hard to come as for a camel to thread the postern of a small needle's eye." Thoughts tending to ambition, they do plot unlikely wonders, how these vain weak nails may tear a passage through the flinty ribs of this hard world, my ragged prison walls, and for they cannot die in their own pride. Thoughts tending to content, flatter themselves that they are not the first of fortune's slaves, nor shall not be the last. Like silly beggars who, sitting in the stocks, refuge their shame that many have and others must sit there. And in this thought they find a kind of ease, bearing their own misfortunes on the back of such as have before endured the like. Thus play I in one person, many people, and none contented. Sometimes I am a king. Then treason makes me wish myself a beggar, and so I am. Then crushing penury persuades me I was better when a king. Then am I kinged again, and by think that I am unkinged by Bolingbroke, and straight am nothing. But whate'er I be, nor I, nor any man that but man is, with nothing shall be pleased, till he be eased with being nothing. Music. Do I hear? Keep time. How sour sweet music is when time is broken, no proportion kept. So it is in the music of men's lives. And here have I the daintiness of ear to check time broken, a disordered pipe, but for the concord of my state and time, had not an ear to hear my true time broke. I wasted time, and now does time waste me? For now hath time made me his numbering clock. My thoughts are minutes, and with sighs they jar their watches on unto mine eyes, the outward watch, whereto my finger like a dial's point is pointing still, in cleansing them from tears. Now, sir, The sound that tells what hour it is are clamorous groans which strike upon my heart, which is the bell. So sighs and tears and groans show minutes, times and hours, but my time runs posting on in Bolingbroke's proud joy, while I stand fooling here his jack of the clock. Oh, this music makes me mad. Let it sound no more. For though it hath holp madmen to their wits, in me it seems it will make wise men mad. Yet blessing on his heart that gives it me, for 'tis a sign of love, and love to Richard is a strange brooch in this all-hating world.
Hi, I'm Dr Wanda Wyporska, an early modern historian of witchcraft. And joining us on the panel today are Adjoa Andoh, a critically acclaimed star of stage and screen, whose credits include Doctor Who, Invictus, and of course Bridgerton. In 2009, she helmed an all-woman of colour production of Richard II at Shakespeare's Globe. Also joining us is Dr Andy Kesson, a theatre historian and academic, whose work explores the playhouses of London. He's a leader of the Before Shakespeare Research Project and is the founder of A Bit Lit. And we also have Dr Vanessa Lim with us, a literary and intellectual historian whose work focuses on classical rhetoric in Shakespeare. So welcome, everybody.
Hi.
And we're going to all do our bit to make the women of Shakespeare visible and the women in the world of Shakespeare visible this evening, because this event is, of course, Shakespeare's Sisters. So I'd like to start with looking at the women who were running playhouses and who were part of theatrical life before and during the time of Shakespeare. So I'm going to turn to Andy first of all to tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you. I need to start by saying thank you to Adjoa for that wonderful performance, and what a great soliloquy for this moment of lockdown, of being on your own and thinking about what that means for your identity. But Richard II, as he's in prison, also wants to people this little world. And I guess the Before Shakespeare project was trying to think about the theatres from the time when they hadn't yet been invented, and thinking about the entrepreneurs who looked around early modern London and thought, I can put money into building a space to stage plays regularly, and I can make money for that by peopling this little world which I'm about to create. And we think of the theatre of Shakespeare's time as quintessentially male. We talk about the all-male stage. And the most exciting thing coming out of the work of Before Shakespeare, I think, is that when we went back to that first generation and did a head count, 50% of the people building, running, or financing the theatres were women. And they've been entirely written out of history. So there are three kinds of theatrical spaces that are being invented essentially in the 1560s, 70s, and 80s, just before Shakespeare arrives in London. If this event is called Shakespeare's Sisters, in a way, these are kind of Shakespeare's mothers, but not, in a very non-familial kind of a way. The kinds of playing spaces which most often get forgotten are the inn playing spaces, right in the city itself, the city of London. They are central to the city. They are the most sought after by players. They're the longest lived of the playing spaces of Shakespeare's time, and they're the most often forgotten. And there are 4 such inns regularly putting on performances, and 3 of those 4 are owned or leased by women. And I thought I'd focus on one woman per kind of playhouse. So here is the inn playhouse. And I was going to look at the Cross Keys playing space, which is owned for 20 years by Alice Leiston, in the years in which it first becomes a theatre, first becomes a space for regular playing. She's a fantastic historical figure who has been almost entirely forgotten and was rediscovered by the scholar David Kathman. At one point, Leiston is running the Cross Keys site with another woman, Emma Ibbotson, at which point it becomes an all-female business enterprise, just as Shakespeare's career gets going. And when she is succeeded by a man after she dies, rather wonderfully, the man is called James Bear, and he's a pirate. So she's even succeeded by a very particular kind of masculinity. The Cross Keys is regularly named as the central playing space of Shakespeare's time. And 100 years later, when Richard Flecknoe looks back on the playing culture of Shakespeare's time, it's the cross keys that he remembers. And there is Alice Leiston right at the forefront. The second kind of playing space is the Amphitheatre, the large outdoor space in the suburbs of London, in Shoreditch in this early period. And the modern Globe is an example of a replica of this kind of playing space. And this is the one which is most familiar to us. The most famous in the early period is called the theatre. And it's given that name at a time when theatre is still an ancient Greek word, which doesn't really mean an awful lot to an English-speaking audience. And it's built by Margaret Brain, alongside other entrepreneurs, including her husband and including the Burbages, with whom Shakespeare will go on to work with. But Margaret Brain actually finances the building of the theatre. And when they run out of money, she picks up the tools and she does the carpentry work to finish the building off. She couldn't have been more hands-on in her relationship with it. And about 10 years after the theatre opened, she's actually beaten off the premises by broomstick by the Burbages when she's trying to lay claim to some of the profit from the theatre itself. And that includes Ellen Burbage. So we have kind of woman-on-woman exclusion here. You can see the marginalisation of this female entrepreneur happening in the period itself. And then the final woman I thought I'd throw into the mix to start this conversation off is at the third kind of playing space in Shakespeare's time, which is the indoor playing spaces. Adjoa has just given us that speech from Richard II, and that production happened in the Sam Wanamaker Playhouse at the Globe. That's a replica of an indoor playing space. And in the early 1580s, the Blackfriars, the first Blackfriars Playhouse, is owned by Anne Farrant. We have some of her business letters, and most excitingly of all, the first Blackfriars is the first playhouse to give us a surviving repertory of plays. We have plays from this playhouse, and this is the first surviving suite of plays. And those plays are fascinated by female characters. Many of them are named after female protagonists. Shakespeare never names a play after a single female character. And they're full of women, to the point where there are often more women than men. Sometimes it's quite hard to find men in these plays. And the largest part for a female character in Shakespeare's lifetime is written for the boy companies that play in indoor spaces. So we have a huge number of women working in these playhouses, but those are three that feel particularly interesting and exciting to me coming out of this work.
Andy, were there any other ways in which women were involved other than owning the playhouses?
Absolutely, yes. So there are women backstage. There's been some brilliant work done on backstage costumers, for example, prop designers, things that often perhaps theatre historians aren't so good at thinking about, including who might be providing food for the performers. And this includes not just the professional and the commercial playing spaces, but also playing at court. There's a really heartbreaking story in the 1570s where a whole bunch of children are brought to court to put on a mask for Elizabeth I, but she's pretty tired and she does not want to see the mask. And it's too late to send them home. It's midnight. So they get sent off to stay with a lady called Mrs. Sparrow. Sadly, I think not an actual sparrow. And she puts them up for the night and feeds them and is feeding them the next day. And they're finally allowed to perform the following day, close to midnight, and are then taken back by boat from Hampton Court, I think, and dumped at the Blackfriars Pier, where they are shivering cold and absolutely starving. And I think if it wasn't for Mistress Sparrow, they would have been starving much longer than that. So yes, women involved backstage and also providing things like food for performers.
And I think that point about the preponderance of female characters is really interesting, because it's not something that, you know, the average person really associates with Shakespeare, because we do hear about those male characters so much. Other than, I have to say, as a historian of witchcraft, you know, obviously we do come in for our fair share of mentions of the three witches. But Adjoa, in terms of the depth of his female characters, what's your perspective on that?
Andy that was fantastic, Andy. So interesting. I want to know more about Margaret Brain. I want to know about her. I want to play about her, please, tomorrow. Thank you.
Sure.
No, I was thinking what you just said then, oh, you know, about this speech and about lockdown and everything. The thing is that for me, Shakespeare is always on point. what you can pick any play and there'll always be something that's relevant. And I think there's a depth of interest in the world that I think goes into the characters that he writes. But what I find most interesting, so whether I've got my director's hat on or, I'm on the audition panel at RADA and I see lots of drama schools and so I see lots of work, is that the number of times that we take the women that are there, and yes, there are fewer in number, but we take the women that are there and then in our performances, we reduce them. And I think it's an absolute artistic and creative choice. I've played Portia. I played both the Portias. I have bones of contention with both the Portias. We quite often see Portia when she's being chosen, and she's got her big speech, her big thing with Bassanio, and she's saying, "Oh, I want you to choose, and I love you," and all that stuff. And you quite often see them played sort of a bit lovey-dovey. And I think this woman has just eviscerated. She's about to go and eviscerate Shylock in court. Her brain is this big. She owns the land, the property, the big house, the terrace and the vineyards and all that. It's hers. And we play them as these sort of mimsy, whimsy, woozy women. And it's like, stop doing that. Portia, similarly, the other Portia with Brutus, she's Cato's daughter. She's like the Jackie Kennedy of the social world at that time. She knows about politicians. She knows about philosophy. She's the daughter of the great Stoic. And then they play me. She's going to swallow fire. That's who she. So I think we do a disservice to the women that are in Shakespeare a lot of the time. They're quite often mighty women, and I think it's something to do with what you've just described, Andy, that lack of attention to and a lack of a historical remembrance and celebration of how mighty women are. And I think we reduce ourselves, and I think we do it all the time. I know that when I'm, when I said to the Globe, when we were going to do our Richard II in 2019, at the same time that Brexit was happening, and I said I wanted all women of colour because I want to talk about the Commonwealth, I want to talk about slavery, I want to talk about colonisation and why this England that we're all loving with John of Gaunt that's being trashed, how this England gets to be built. When I said I want every single person involved in that production to be a woman of colour, the pushback was tremendous. Just like, what? The fight director, the voice coach, the composer, the blah, 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 yes. Why? Because we can do all that stuff. Like Margaret doing a bit of carpentry to get the theatre finished. We can do everything. There's not anything that we cannot do that women have not been doing forever and a day. And I think, I'm sort of veering a bit, Wanda, I know. But just in terms of the women in Shakespeare, we have to re-imbue ourselves as women with that knowledge and that energy. And it speaks to how many women directors we have, who makes you take any industry you like. It doesn't have to be theatre. You go and do petrochemicals, whatever. Where is the equal perspective on the contributions, the wisdom, the brilliance, the spontaneity, the discovery and curiosity of women? Where is it held to the same level as men? And so if you've got male directors, I know directors that cut the women out of we don't really need that part, cut it out. And it's like, no, make it substantial in the way that you direct the shows, in the way that you foreground these characters, and every time a woman gives you a mimsy performance, smack the back of the knees, come along. That's who's that? Shakespeare's so juicy. Get every ounce of Shakespeare juice you can get for all the characters, and even more so if we have a smaller canvas to play with. It's got to be peppery, and it's got to be spicy, and it's got to be rich. So, I could enumerate all the look. Constance, Hermione, Queen Margaret. There's Lady Macbeth. I played Lady Macbeth when I was breastfeeding. It was hilarious. We were filming it, and every so often I'd be like, I'd hear a child 12 miles away, and I'd be like, "Fa-choing!" And I'd be like, yeah, can we change my costume? I mean, I think about Lady Macbeth. Maybe she was breastfeeding, and she said, I would take this baby if I had agreed to do what. Do you know what I mean? It's like, come on. These women are extraordinary. Even, the jailer's daughter, I'm going to break him out of jail because I love him so much. I'm just gonna, it's bold. We have to remember the boldness of these characters, even the big scary ones like Tamara, or just, we have to get back into the mightiness of them and re-imbue them with everything that they have. So I'll stop in a second. There was a great documentary I was watching last night about Maccabee motorbike riders who wanted to, the Maccabee Games, big Jewish games, was being held in Berlin for the first time a few years ago. And there was a father who had survived the war, an elderly gentleman, and he talks about being in a cattle truck, and somebody else in the cattle truck forces the door open and jumps out of the cattle truck, and their coat catches in the wheels, and they are pulled under the train and sliced in half by the wheels. And then this boy's mother throws her 4-year-old son, who's just witnessed this, out the same cattle truck and then jumps out after him to get away from the Gestapo. That's what mothers do. Come on. Give our women back their full heft. And, Shakespeare is a wonderful place to do that because the language is so good and the stakes are always so high, So, here endeth the lecture, sorry.
No, that is absolutely brilliant. And I would like to have that clip in every school across the land, because if you don't want to just rush out and go and watch some Shakespeare after listening to that, then I think you're obviously asleep or dead, basically. I mean, it's all about the relevance of Shakespeare, isn't it? It's about the relevance of the human condition. And if there's anything that we know as historians, it's that we are not different from people 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago. We've got the same blooming problems, haven't we? So, it is about human nature. And I think that boldness of women, I mean, I just want you to just go and remake every Shakespeare play possible right now.
Happily. I absolutely bloody would right now.
With all those women. So that boldness of women, that heft. I mean, do we see this, Vanessa, in the rhetoric in terms of Shakespeare's characters in his plays?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you so much, Adjoa, for that riveting reading of Richard's soliloquy and Andy's such interesting anecdotes about these women behind the scenes who we absolutely don't hear about. But yes, absolutely, it's there in the rhetoric, it's there in the language, it's there on the page. So, for example, when we think about Portia in The Merchant of Venice, that powerful speech that she has on the quality of mercy. I mean, that's drawn, Shakespeare draws that from the rhetorical handbooks. He draws that from what the Roman rhetoricians say about how to construct a speech in the courtroom, how to construct an absolutely forensic piece of argument. So it's there in the language. It's all there in the language. And what I think is really interesting in what we've been discussing so far is that we acknowledge that the 16th century and 17th century was deeply a misogynistic culture in lots of ways. There's no denying that, but the theatre as a playing space is really where you can allow these women characters to speak, where these possibilities are manifest on the stage with these characters. So it's there on the linguistic level. And I want to say that rhetorical culture in the past, in this period, which is what I work on, is a very masculine space. The rhetoricians, grammar school textbooks, they speak of the ideal orator, the ideal citizen, the ideal speaker as a man. It's always a he, it's always encoded as a he, and as a result, we don't have many instances of women, for example, studying the rhetorical arts, and so they're excluded from these public spaces. They're excluded from forms of public discourse. But what we've been discussing so far really highlights for me that the stage, this little world, is a space where these voices can be heard and can be played. Yeah.
Isn't it interesting though? Even with that Portia speech, she's using great rhetoric to seemingly be talking about mercy, but she's using it to nail Shylock to the wall. That is a tour de force, isn't it, of the art of argument in the most argumentative of settings. And on the one hand you go, well done, Portia. Oh, what she do? Oh, okay. So the loathed and despised Jew is being trashed by your verbal dexterity and brilliance. It's a great dual thing that Shakespeare's doing. He's going, oh no, yeah, beautiful.
So I would posit the question after listening to all of this, and I'm sure there must be theses written on this. Was Shakespeare a feminist then?
I don't know, I feel very aware of being the only man on the panel. I don't want to jump on that, but I want to gently pitch Shakespeare as a non-feminist, and I'll step back and let other people tell me where I'm wrong. But I think one of the things that's really interesting about Shakespeare's work, and everything that Vanessa and Andrew have both said is absolutely right, and it's so exciting. But his plays quite often move to kind of bottle that female energy in their structure. So we don't end the play with Portia. After all of those kind of glorious things in Act 4 that Portia gives us, we end with this deeply disappointing male world. Lady Macbeth disappears halfway through the play. She asks what her husband's going to do, and he says, "Be innocent of the knowledge, dearest Chuck," which is Elizabethan for "I'm not going to tell you, you little chicken." And she only appears again, sleeping, talking without realizing it, doing things without realizing it. And I think he is a writer he's wonderful, and he does such exciting things for all of his characters. But I do think the plays move to position women in a very particular way. And he is writing, as I was trying to say at the outset, in a period in which women are incredibly focal on stage, to the point where there's actually more plays about women when he starts writing than there are about men. And he then writes nearly 40 plays, not one of which manages to get a woman by name into the title of his plays without being accompanied by a man, that is. So I wonder a little bit about Shakespeare. His first appearance in print identifies him as the author of the line in Henry VI, Part 3, "O tiger's heart wrapped in a woman's hide," as if that misogynistic line is Shakespeare's calling card at the start of his career. And this is the author of Taming of the Shrew. Andrew, you just mentioned Margaret of Anjou, for example. Those early plays are not happy about women in public spaces taking political power. They are there and they're wonderful while they're doing it, but I'm not sure if the plays themselves always seem that happy about it.
Yeah, I just think concept of feminism, it's too retro. I find it too retrospective to stick it. It's like, but lest we forget, he's writing at a time of mighty women in politics. Obviously not all the time, but Elizabeth I is an extraordinary long-lived and rather brilliant strategist and power broker, and then she's got the girls around her. She's the scary Marys, and there's and I just think there are lots of mighty women around Shakespeare, but at the same time he's a man of his time. I think I would say that Lady Macbeth speech is a great the Lady Macbeth speech when she's sleepwalking is a great deconstruction of a mental breakdown and the weight of behaviors that you come to regret that destroy you on stage, and given in this brilliant way by a female character. And I don't think of her as weak for that. And I would say with the Chuck, I would say I would look at it as a term of deflection and endearment. It speaks more to how he's feeling about his heart than it maybe does about how he values his wife. So, but I don't know that Shakespeare is a great feminist, but I think he is really interested in the human condition, and women are entirely in that. And I think you can approach all of the women as fully rounded characters. I mean, I have arguments with, show me a satisfying end of Taming of the Shrew in the 21st century, and I will give you all the sweets in the shop, because I just haven't seen it. Similarly, go to Titus Andronicus and just tell me anything that is redeeming about Aaron. That character, you can dance about it and shiggle it about and try and make it good, but what is redeeming? So, yes, we can certainly pick holes in his perspective, but I think there's a level of humanity that he's interested and curious about, that makes the women whole if we approach them like that. There's a yeah.
Yeah, I just want to add that I completely agree with what Adjoa and Andy have said, and I too am going to put a big question mark next to the idea that we can consider Shakespeare a feminist. I mean, he, as Adjoa says, he's absolutely a man of his time, imbricated in the ideas and contexts of his time. So it's tempting, to take out certain characters and say, here's a powerful woman. Is Shakespeare feminist then? I think that those links are tenuous. And Adjoa is right. I mean, Shrew is such a problematic play, and we really need to think about, staging and how you might perform it, and so on, in order to. Is it relevant to our time today? This play, I'm not quite sure. So yes, I completely agree. With putting a question mark at the end of that statement. Yeah.
And how do we think the wider politics and ideas of Shakespeare's time have fed into his writing? And how does that apply to the women in his plays? Because obviously we do, as you've said, have a very powerful queen who's been in power for some time. But as you rightly point out, we can't forget the fact that most women didn't enjoy that level of power, or even that level of power within their own households.
I think a really interesting example in this regard is Paulina in The Winter's Tale, because she speaks really powerfully, really boldly, and really plainly, and she occupies the role of what we might think of as a royal counselor. And she adopts a rhetorical mode of plain speaking, of boldly speaking, that we might think of as parrhesia, this Greek concept of bold, free speech. And she's not afraid to use it. And this is a really dangerous position to be in, right? To be a royal counselor, because your job is to speak truth to power, to tell the king what he needs to hear, not what he wants to hear. And I think something really interesting happens in that play, because she's arguably the most effective counselor. She puts him, the king, in his place, and she's of course pivotal in that transformation of Hermione coming back at the end of The Winter's Tale, and so on. So I think Shakespeare puts or discusses these or dramatizes and depicts these political ideas in very interesting ways in his plays. It's not as straightforward as we might want to suggest, because here he's giving a woman this powerful role of the plain speaking counselor, which I find really interesting. Yeah.
So this is about where Shakespeare's theatrical politics sit within the wider politics around him, right? And I guess there's that tension about how we feel about how he sits in that time. Is he a man of his time, which is a phrase we've been using through the conversation. And I guess in a way, I'm sort of resisting that. In a way, I'm wondering if he's reacting against his time. I'm certainly not saying Elizabethan England is a feminist utopia. It definitely is not. But actually, there seems to be a move against the predominance of female characters on the stage, not just in Shakespeare's work, but also in Marlowe's. And Adjoa used the phrase, the mightiness of women, which is fantastic. And Christopher Marlowe gets called mighty in his lifetime. People talk about Marlowe's mighty line, the blank verse line. And I think that those two writers in particular get really strongly associated in the later centuries with masculinity. And so that question of whether Taming of a Shrew is a good play for the 21st century, was it a good play for the 16th century? We don't know much about its reception in its own time, but my goodness, it was popular in the 18th century when the idea that women belong in the domestic space is being much more loudly spoken. And so I think Shakespeare actually occupies a really strange place in the period of his own time. Let me just give you an example. Elizabeth I is watching plays at court just as Shakespeare gets to London. In a single season of plays at court, she's watching plays entirely named after female characters and about female experience. She's watching The Mask of Amazons. She's watching a play called The Cruelty of a Stepmother. Why would you ever show Elizabeth I a play with that title, given how many stepmothers she had, and also that terrible dad? Really extraordinary. But yeah, at a time in which, as I say, more plays are being written about women than about men, we have a second generation of theatre makers coming into these new playhouses, like Shakespeare, like Marlowe, working with women backstage, but actually showing as women less, not more. So that question of how he is of his time, I think, is a really difficult one. I think we need to think both what we mean by Shakespeare and his time when we use that phrase.
I mean, I think about class a lot when I think about Shakespeare, and the sense of somebody lacking in power, finding ways of navigating to stay safe, and actually to do more than stay safe, to make themselves solid and sort of immured by sufficient social standing, cash money and property to be protected from the vagaries of what's going on around. I think about his I think about the merchant status of his family. I think about his Catholicism at a time of pushback against Catholics. I think about where he is in the country geographically, how glamorous is Stratford-upon-Avon. I think about his possible creative taste that makes him want to make the work and be somewhere at a time when everybody had to have somebody who they could dedicate their work to get some cash money. I think about money a lot with Shakespeare. I think about any freelancer will say the same. You're doing the lovely work, but the rent needs to be paid. So which director are you going to make nice to? Can I be in your show? Can I be in your all that? I don't think any of that changes. And I think he's from a class that would mean he's got to find what's his edge, where can he get himself in and get himself successful, whether it's about the way he nuances a play. Like for years I had real problems with Richard III because I love Richard III, and I always felt like he must make sweetie sweetie with his queen, so I suppose I'm saying within all of that, I always feel that there's a weather eye on the powerless in his plays. The character, I suppose I think about Richard II a lot because I adapted it and did all of that thinking about it. But I think about the gardener scene You know, I think about these people are attached to this household. If this household goes down, they're stuffed. So, you know, the way he has these characters that we now play as comedy characters, you know, with a bit of a rural accent going on here. And you think these people have to know what is going on in the world, because they have to know which way to dodge to avoid it when something goes down. And I think Shakespeare always sees those people, and he gives them a voice, and he allows us to know that they know they're watching which way the wind blows, because they will be the first ones to catch it in a storm, which is always the case with powerless people everywhere. So I think I do think that there is a perspective about the powerless people, and into that conversation comes women. And I think they get scooped up in that gaze, I guess, which isn't just about the kings. You know, the way Hal just shafts Falstaff. It's so, you know, and Shakespeare doesn't shy away from any of that stuff. He just lets you see all these people doing stuff that's sort of reprehensible, while at the same time you're going, but look, he just wants his dad to love him. He never gives us he rarely gives us either or. So it's tricky. I think there's something about him having a weather eye on the politics of his time that comes into all of that. You know, it's fascinating to me that how much did he allow Richard II to go on the night before Essex tried his uprising? How much did he allow it? How much did he hate the idea of it happening then? You know, where was he looking in terms of the politics of, oh my God, which way is this going to go? It's fascinating, but I think his gaze is always that of somebody who's got to box clever the whole time. Look at the amount of property he amassed before he died, and you know, yeah.
I think that's really interesting in terms of representation in his plays as well. And how have we historically tackled problems of representation in the canon in terms of the actors and those on stage, which obviously, Adjoa, you know, you mentioned earlier on. How has this changed throughout the centuries?
Well, you know, we're coming up to the 200th anniversary of Ira Aldrich, you know, playing lead roles. So there's this extraordinary black man that's come over from America. How the hell did he even get out of there? How did he make a reputation in Europe? And not only that, but when he comes to England, he changes the style of Shakespearean acting. You know, we stop teapotting and spouting forth and doing, I'm just going to do it here. And he kind of talks to, this person next to me, I'll maybe talk to them. So I think there have been little moments, and Shakespeare gives you scope to do all of that stuff. But I think we will struggle with all of that because art is part of the world. So, you know, just as we could talk about the representation of everybody in any workforce, so the same in a theatrical workforce doing Shakespeare. But Shakespeare gives you the space to be part of that conversation, and that's what I love. So as a woman, I think, you know, if the part doesn't demand that you be a man, or that that it's a gendered conversation that needs to happen in that way, it's quite interesting to just go, you go and be that general. Why not? Women have always been generals. Sorry if they weren't written that way, but, you know, go do it and see what that tells us about now.
So how was it to helm that production of Richard II with a cast made exclusively of women of colour?
It was very moving. It was incredibly stressful, you know, because you've gone, yes, we can do everything and we'll give you a bloody good show. And then you're like, my first day of rehearsals, I was like, nobody be shit. Nobody can be shit in this show. On point with the scanning, on point with the words. Don't say anything that you don't understand. Doesn't matter. There's no question that's too stupid. The only stupid person is the one that doesn't ask the question. You know, all that sort of, it was glorious. I started in socialist feminist touring, small scale touring theatre with a company called Theatre Centre. in the 80s. The first play I ever did was written by a black woman, and it was all black women, and that was 1984. So I worked with Gay Sweatshop and the Women's Theatre Group, and so to me, this is just like, yeah, or women of colour. What? It's. I feel like we're on a loop. You know, this stuff was happening decades ago, and now we're having to push to have it happen again. You know, it's like I had a company for a while, and we were doing plays by female wits the whole time, just to kind of go, there's some great women writers out there, and they've been doing it a very long time. So so it was it was very moving, but it was also incredibly frustrating, because I felt like we were having to reinvent the wheel, and we shouldn't have to do it, and there shouldn't be pushback. It should be like, yeah, what's your point? Is it a good production? So in the end, that's what you have to do. You have to go, please, we have to do a good production. But for me, what was great was just seeing an audience that was peopled with a wider variety of members than one would often expect at a Shakespeare. And you know, we did have the first day, we all gathered together, and we had 3 days of cultural sharing, where I was working with Lynette Linton, who now runs The Bush, a brilliant young director, and I just said, let's have everybody bring something in that resonates from their life with the play. So it could be a piece of music, or a silly dance, or food, or a piece of fabric. And everybody came with their stories about how they came to be in this country plying their trade. And it was all about, there were so many people in that company who had whose parents had bags by the door, whether they were, fleeing from Iraq, or China, or the Philippines, or Trinidad, or wherever it was. There were so many stories, or fleeing from Hitler, whatever. There were so many stories of people with bags by the door. And people came into that rehearsal room, and we cried. We cried for not having to be the only one in the room, because that's so often the case. And that's not just in our industry, that's in many workplaces. You're either representing your race, or you're representing your gender. And actually, some days you just want to go to work and represent being an actor or an academic or whatever else it is, and not have to speak for your genitalia or your melanin. So so that was what was particularly moving, and also it was just a great bunch of people. So it's lovely, and it was fun. We laughed a lot, and if people had to go and pick up their kids, or they needed to go and lie down because they were having a terrible period day, or they had elderly relatives that had gone AWOL and they had to be found, we just folded that into the rehearsals, because that's life. And women do a lot of that stuff, so let's make it part of the work.
That sounds
if I may, if I may jump on, I just want to thank you, Adjoa, for sharing that, and for the work you did on that production, because I feel that so intensely. I present as someone of East Asian, Southeast Asian descent. I speak with a non-standard, non-Anglophone accent. When I walk into Shakespeare conferences as a scholar, when I walk into the classroom as a teacher, sometimes I just want to be a person who works on Shakespeare, but I can't change the way I present, or the way I speak, or the way I look. And it goes to the question of, who does Shakespeare belong to? What does an actor of Shakespeare look like? What does a scholar of Shakespeare look like? And I think that's, frustrating to have to still deal with that today, and to still have to think about it, because it's just frankly exhausting when you just want to do your work.
It's so boring. It's just like, see what I've got to say about the thing we're talking about, which is not the thing I walk about in 7 days a week.
Absolutely. And so it was a great pleasure for me to recently teach adaptations of Shakespeare, which recover dramatic voices which are around the play. So for example, Janet Sears's Harlem Duet was incredibly powerful to teach, a play in which she imagines that before Othello was with Desdemona, he was married to a Black woman named Billy. That was so fun and powerful and interesting to teach. Toni Morrison and Rokia Traore's Desdemona was equally interesting. So when we talk about Shakespeare representation in the canon, and thinking about how we can make Shakespeare more diverse, include more women of color, we should perhaps also look to these adaptations as well. Yeah, but no, thank you so much for sharing that, Adjoa. It made me feel not so alone.
You're never alone, Vanessa. There's loads of us.
I feel like that's a good place to end, because I think what we're saying is Shakespeare is for everybody, and we can all find our peace and ourselves in Shakespeare, and we can all find Shakespeare in ourselves. So I'd just like to thank our guests this evening, Dr. Andy Kesson, Dr. Vanessa Lim, and the absolutely wonderful Adjoa Andoh. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Wanda. Thank you.
A huge thank you to tonight's panellists, and a big thank you to you, our audience, for tuning in. Please remember to check out the What's On pages to find out what other events are coming up. Also, you can find out about future events on HistFest's website, which is www.histfest.org. Thank you.